and it played into this widespread public perception that, that the police had tactics that could be used to control crime, which was only on the table because people didn't seem to understand that crime was already falling. Cameras became completely ubiquitous by the 2000s, and since the 2001 terrorist attacks, obviously this kind of surveillance is I mean, it's everywhere, and no one is opposed to it anymore. We've all just sort of tacitly accepted the idea that in our public spaces we'll be monitored. They're adding technology to this, such as facial recognition software and video content analysis. And what these are going to do are they're going to enable the cameras themselves to make a determination about events that are out of the ordinary, and then notify the people who are monitoring the cameras that there's something that needs to be looked at. Which sounds sensible and like a labor-saving device until you think about it conceptually, and you realize that this is a situation in which Microsoft is writing an algorithm that is going to determine who in New York gets watched by the police. The next evolution of the technology, which is shockingly already deployed, is a system that was developed by the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, and it's called Argus 1S. And what this technology, I know this is just like a pretty classic example of militarizing the police force here. What this technology does is it allows the police to hack into your cell phone camera. Because even though the police have to get a warrant, I think, to track your GPS information on your cell phone, they can hack your cell phone camera. But it's like uncharted territory. So they hack your cell phone camera, and then they use information that they gather from that to determine your location. And just to repeat, this technology is already in place. Like, this is something that the NYPD does. The legal justification for all this is, it stems from a 1967 Supreme Court case, which is called Katz versus the United States. And it ruled that using technology to survey a citizen only represents an unlawful search and seizure if that person enjoys a reasonable expectation of privacy. And subsequent interpretations have indicated that if you're in a public or semi-public space, you do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy. The actual 1967 case, while I was reading it, was pretty dated. It was about a man who made a phone call to buy drugs from a phone booth, which wouldn't come up today, but he assumed that he had a reasonable expectation of privacy. In contrast to all this, this is Khayelitsha, which is a township that I was lucky enough to get to visit in Cape Town, South Africa. And when I was talking to community groups in Khayelitsha, they actually wanted CCTV cameras in their township. They saw it as something that would improve security, and they also saw it as a sign of police neglect, that their poor neighborhood wasn't receiving the same level of attention from the police as other neighborhoods. So a lot of different ways of working through this. Now we're going to move on to drones. And I would like to start with a question. The question I'd like you all to think about right now is why a drone is different than a helicopter, aside from the fact that they make us feel creepy. Aren't they just a continuation of a pre-existing surveillance tactic? That we've been doing helicopters right for 50 years. I mean, you think of the Los Angeles helicopters, which were deployed in the 1960s, dovetailed with the Vietnam War. Police technology generally follows military tactics at about a decade lag, and in many ways, drones are just a continuation of this decade lag that we have agreed that we tolerate. We have militarized police, that's the way that it works. But there are some big differences with drones. Drones are much cheaper than helicopters, and they're also much smaller, which means that the kind of high-level surveillance that has previously been reserved for extremely risky or particular situations, something that is a scarce resource, they'll be able to deploy it almost universally. There'd be no reason not to have these drones up all the time, you know? And because the drones are smaller, it makes them potentially a lot more invasive. Like, I don't know if you guys have seen the little videos of it, but they have drones that are this big, can fly into a room, and it can stick itself to a wall, and there's a camera in there and a microphone. So, at a certain point, judges are going to be writing search warrants for that sort of technology. And part of the conversation is that a tactic that we want to have the people who are monitoring us use. This is a drone that was used in Seattle, and I actually think this is a funny drone because they paid $80,000 for 2 of these, and it could only stay in the air for 15 minutes. This is the limited state of the technology. It can only stay in the air for 15 minutes, and if you look closely, you can see that this is just a regular digital camera that's in a little harness. So, I mean, maybe we have a little ways to go before we have to worry about this. Thinking about this from a civil liberties perspective, making it cheaper to gather information means that policing authorities will do more of it. Like, they will be gathering more information because the cost of doing that is lower for them. And new information technology means that there's effectively no upward limit on the amount of data, big data, that these agencies are able to crunch and interpret. So there's the limits to this thing, the boundaries of the police's ability to collect information have just been pushed dramatically outward. In New York, at a press conference in January, Ray Kelly said, the police commissioner, said the police are looking into acquiring drones for use during mass protests like Occupy Wall Street. Luckily, responses to drones have been very widespread and vocal compared to other policing tactics. This has a lot to do with the perception that this is potentially ubiquitous technology, so it could be used on anyone, not just the bad guys. And I was seeing a lot of the themes in the recent Rand Paul 13-hour anti-drone filibuster. In Florida, the Florida Senate voted unanimously on April 9th to ban police departments from using drones, except in the case of terror acts. And as Senator Joe Negron put it, quote, "It's fine to kill terrorists in Afghanistan and Pakistan with drones, but I don't think we should use them to monitor the activities of law-abiding Floridians." Just reminding us that this is a highly racialized conversation. Seattle planned to use these crappy drones. And the money, by the way, the place they got the money to pay for these drones was the Department of Homeland Security. But there were widespread protests, and they canceled the program in February with no intention to resume it. In New York, the attitude toward drones has been sort of fatalistic, which is Bloomberg. And this whole quote from Mayor Bloomberg goes, "I just don't see how you can stop them. We're going to have more visibility and less privacy. You can't keep the tide from coming in." The question Bloomberg raises is a good one, and almost the note I'm going to end on, which is, at the end of the day, are drones inevitable? On the one hand, drones are very, very cheap. An effective drone costs just a few $100. They're also safer than a helicopter because they don't put a pilot at risk, and if they crash, it's a lot smaller, it's a lot less weight. From the perspective of solid citizens, they're less invasive because they're quieter, a lot of them run on electricity, again, they're smaller, they don't create a big shadow, they use infrared cameras, there's no need for lights. It's a good question, and one that I don't know the answer to. I leave it to you guys to contemplate. But it is important to note the many links to the defense establishment when talking about this. The NYPD's drone program is also going to be paid for by Homeland Security, as well as in Miami. And the justification for using drones in urban areas, particularly the reference to the safety of the pilot, are similar to the ones used in war zones. They say this is an effective technology, this is a more effective technology. So if we want to accept that logic, that's one thing, but we should definitely recognize its origins. The domain awareness system that we use in New York is actually designed to interface with this kind of visual data. And that's being built by Microsoft, as mentioned. So there's pressure from the corporate side to have this technology be more widely used to sort of justify their product. It's not an isolated incident. Microsoft and IBM are both making big bets on the idea that this kind of monitoring is the next frontier in city management. And unless an alternative vision is articulated, their vision will become the vision. Just to wrap up, it's clear that monitoring as a policing strategy has grown a lot more sophisticated than in the past. It now works on the principle of preventative action, which potentially punishes people for behavior that is sub-criminal. And because of the demographics of crime, it is also highly racialized. It relies on managing poor populations as if they are an offensive force. The beneficiaries are primarily people with means. The trend is expanding irrespective of how many crimes are being committed, and despite evidence indicating that it doesn't work. It also raises numerous troubling civil liberties questions, as well as questions about the useful deployment of public resources. And it leaves me to wonder, when will we get back to policing strategies that attempt to address the causes of crime instead of the symptoms? Thank you.
Just a few minutes for questions.
Yeah.
I know you're talking a lot about closed circuit TV and how the amount doesn't really relate to the effectiveness. Regarding the terrorist attack that recently happened, I know I've been reading reports that they're using a lot of the closed circuit television to find suspects and stuff. And what would you say in terms of events like that? Does that help outweigh the ineffectiveness on the scale?
Well, it's an interesting question. In London, there was a terrorist attack that they say was solved using this technology. And now we have the Boston thing. I think that the terrorism argument is always a strong argument. But terrorist incidents are such a huge outlier that I think it's important that we be really critical when we're thinking about the kinds of trade-offs that we're willing to make to prevent those kinds of outliers. It's like Charles' example of the car accidents, right? Like, we all know that if we lower the speed limit by 10 miles an hour, it would reduce traffic deaths by X amount, right? But we're not afraid of that, so we don't do that. What we do instead is we increase policing for our neighborhoods. So we all know that the things that are most likely to kill us are not terrorist attacks. But we're not afraid of those things that are most likely to kill us. We're afraid of the terrorist attacks. And so we tolerate this gradual erosion of our civil liberties. And as to whether or not they're an effective technology in those situations, I would say yes, they are an effective technology in those situations. They don't prevent the attacks, but they do make it possible to figure out who did it afterward. So if that's something that we're willing to trade our right to privacy for, by all means, let's have that conversation.
I think the other thing to be careful with too is, so what you see and what you heard from Patrick is that oftentimes this homeland security money, these budgets are being funneled into these police departments. And so while you may be willing to, we may be willing to tolerate this increase in surveillance to identify and hopefully prevent some of these terrorist attacks, what you see is also the deployment of this technology for much more minor, for marijuana possession, for these things that, and so there's a way in which to be critical of it, that you could accept some of that surveillance for certain types of things without allowing this kind of creep into just normal domestic policing.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, we started the lecture talking about how the murder rate has decreased and how that's because of data-driven policing, and then the programs you talked about were about like failures. So what were the successful data-driven policing?
So data-driven policing isn't why the murder rate went down, in my opinion.
Okay.
There's controversy on this, like a lot of different opinions on this thing. But my opinion is that that the murder rate went down because of broader demographic shifts in the society, which simply put, the pool of people, and this is data-driven, which is perilous, but the pool of people who most often commit murders is shrinking fast, really fast, and that is part of why the murder rate has gone down really, really fast, in my opinion. And that's not to say that there aren't. I mean, I'm sure that if you looked, you could find a situation where a gun was pulled off the street by stop and frisk that was going to be used in a crime. I have no doubt that exists. It just doesn't seem, the point that I was trying to bring up is that it's not a proportionate response.
Oh, I have a question. Great job, by the way. There were two excellent presentations. I'm curious, both of you mentioned the drug war as one of the reasons for increased data collection. How much in your, and also it looks like the securitization trend goes along with the rise of the drug war, at least in the United States. I wonder, how much do you think the drug war is a tool of this, of securitization? And how much does it actually cause that all this is really a reaction to having to fight this thing?
Yeah, okay, I would argue, we can talk about this after too, but I would argue that in many ways it's the first situation you proposed, right? That this becomes a cover for much of this extension. In the same way that domestic terrorism becomes the cover, I don't think that the drug concern is a major thing. But we'll talk.
Okay.
All right, thank you guys.
If you have some questions left, obviously Charles will be here on Tuesday, so we can actually start the class or end